Over 50% of all chess games that reach the endgame involve some form of rook endgames in them. This is why it has become increasingly important to be extremely familiar with the basic rook endgames. In today's video, we will be covering some of the basic rook endgames including Philidor, back rank defense and the Luciana positions. In part 2, we will focus on the remaining rook endgames which are a little more advanced and require you to have prior knowledge of these endgames before them. Let's begin. So the first endgame we will be looking at is the Filidor endgame. Here, White wants to get his king to the 6th rank, from where he can use his pawn to shield his king from future checks. This is why we must play Rook at 6. So the Philidor endgame, which is a defensive endgame to create a draw when you are on the defending side, is also commonly known as the 6th rank defense, as it usually means the cutting off of the king from coming on to the 6th rank. And this also means that if he pushes his pawn, then we must move all the way up the board and start giving him checks, as then he cannot defend himself from the checks. Note that this kind of position only occurs when your own king is in front of the enemy pawn, which we had already discussed in the Master the King video. You can check it over here. So let's say White plays king g5. We'll play rook e6, king f5, rook b6. And if White is waiting, then we'll also wait. We'll just do nothing. The moment he pushes his pawn, however, we must go all the way up the board. And now we must continuously give him checks. And if he ever tries to attack our rook, then we just come behind the e pawn and then either win the e pawn or force him to come back to defend the e pawn. And then we get going with our checks. He tries rook h4 to go into a pawn endgame, which we are happy to transpose into because king e7 is now a basic draw in the king and pawn endgame. There's also one more important concept in these rook endgames, which is your king should usually go to the short side. So in the case that suppose his king reaches, so let's say we'll just make a random waiting move. If he plays something like this and you have to escape from the threat of checkmate, you should always go to the short side, which is the side where there are least squares from the pawn. So as you can see here, there are 4 squares and here there are only 3. So this becomes the short side. And you should always take your king to the short side, because then your rook will have more checking ability to give checks. So you can see this has more distance to give checks to the enemy king. This is why you must always take your king to the short side in case you have to move your king, which we didn't have to do in this case. We could have simply played after king e6, we could have played a check and it would transpose back into the position. This was just a thing to demonstrate the point that we should go to the short side with our king and leave the long side for our rook to give checks without getting attacked. The second endgame is the back rank defense. So this is the kind of endgame, it's a very similar setup, but in this case the attacking side has either a G, H, A or B pawn, which means it's not a central pawn. And this means that we can use a passive defense technique. So in this case you can see that White is threatening to checkmate us on the next move with rook b8. So we can either play rook f4 or rook a8. And the correct move is in fact rook a8. The problem with rook f4 is that if you play it, then after check and if he takes and king h7, this is a elementary win in the king pawn endgame. This is why we must avoid trading rooks and simply play rook a8. The point is here White can't make any progress because his own pawn is on the second last file of the board, which means our own king cannot go beyond this file, which he would have very much liked for it to be possible, so that he can move his king here and then successfully push the pawn. But in this case we can always come back and oppose his king again. So to show you what I mean, let's say rook h6, rook f8, rook b7, rook e8, rook g7, king h8, rook h7, king g8. And now just imagine in this position that this pawn was over here. Then what would happen is that we could just push, and the threat of this push would be fatal for black's king. This is why in this kind of position it doesn't work, because there is simply not enough room for the pawn to give a check to the king. And after g6 we can just play rook a8. Even if you play g7 you might even lose after rook a6 check and followed by taking this rook. So it's definitely a draw. The third endgame we want to see in this video is the Luciana endgame. So in such positions, if we are too hasty to bring out our king, we will be bombarded by checks from the black rook. This is why we must build ourselves a shelter using our own rook. So remember in that Philidor position how white tried to create a shelter for his king with his rook. It didn't work there, but it surely will here, as the pawn on e7 is much further advanced. So first we play rook g1 check so that we can get some room for our king to move. If he plays king f6, then king f8 is a direct win because now nothing is stopping the promotion, as the black king is in the way of the rook giving check to our own king. So this loses immediately. If he tries king h6, then we can play rook g4. And the idea is we want to bring our king in this zigzag formation, and when we reach e5, we can simply play rook to e4, which will be blocking the check. Let's say he waits with rook d1. We get our king, he gives checks, we maintain the support of the pawn, we don't want to give up the pawn. And if he's giving more checks, we come to e5 and now rook e4, the promotion is unstoppable. There is one more variation worth looking at, which is if he tries to play king h5 to dislodge our rook from its bridge setting position. Yes, so this building a shelter using your own rook is also known as building the bridge. And after king h5 he's trying to destroy our bridge, but we can simply play rook e4, and now the problem is his king can reach only to g6, which means that we can escape from f8, and after rook f2 king g8 there's no stopping the promotion on e8. So that was the Luciana position where white uses his rook to create a shelter for his king from the black rook's checks. Well, that's it for this video. We will cover the more advanced and more complex endgames in the next video on basic rook endgames. Till then, I'll see you there. Bye.